humans will and must learn. It can't be stopped.
Welcome to the OpenEd podcast. I'm your new sometimes host, Ella Richmond, and I'm here with Isaac Morehouse. How are you doing today?
Good. I like that. The new sometimes host. We have a rotation of sometimes hosts, which is great because it takes the pressure off of one person, needing to be available every single time. But it also just gets a lot more interesting, unique perspectives and types of questions. And I know, Ella, because the way that I very first met you was you asked me to come on your podcast several years ago. You are a great interviewer and you ask very deep and probing questions. So hopefully I haven't set the expectations too high with that, but excited for this convo.
No, hopefully not. I really wanted to spend today's episode talking about first principles. First principles is really, really, really important to you. And as long as I've been working for you, that has been something that you've stressed. So can you first just introduce the topic of first principles, and then we'll dive into kind of first principles in education and why this is such an important topic.
Yeah. So I'm sure there are people out there who have defined first principles or first principles thinking. I don't know. I've never read any of those definitions. I know people talk about it. I'm sure there's something more precise and concrete, but to me, I guess that's kind of like a label that retroactively I have used to describe the way that I try to approach things. And to me, I approach things from this perspective, by the way, not because I think it's like always and everywhere better, but because I'm too stupid to do any other approach. So here's what I mean by first principles. Things that are always true. So if you can find things that are always true, basic underlying relationships, causal relationships, or facts of nature or human nature, and work with those. And obviously you start with the really, really simple basic ones, right? Like, as far as I know, I'm sure there's some quantum physicist somewhere that's going to have something more complex. But as far as I know, every time I drop something, it goes to the floor. There's some force called gravity. However you want to get into the details of what's happening, that happens every time. That's a principle. So I'm not going to build a physical object, for example, that doesn't take that principle into account. I'm not going to build an object that hoping that something heavy, goes upwards without anything propelling it and say, well, just because I want it to. No, I have to understand what are the principles at play, and I have to work with those, not against those. Humans have these principles as well. This is what any good version of studying economics is not about numbers and data. It's about human action. How do humans behave given certain constraints and incentives? And you can't predict every single thing a human's going to do, but you can predict patterns. So an example in economics is if everything else is equal, but the price of something goes up, people will tend to consume less of it. That's a really great principle that you can find me exceptions here and there based on all kinds of crazy stuff, but you don't want to build something that only works if that principle doesn't hold, because it pretty much always holds. So that's kind of, to me, first principle thinking is like things that are true about the world and human nature and nature. But then there's another kind of principle, which maybe you could be considered like ethical or moral, like things that I know I need to do or not do. So if, whether it's because I just objectively believe that they're right or wrong, like I don't want to have a business that only works if I lie to people, for example. Now, I happen to believe that lying is just objectively always, wrong and immoral. Well, I don't know if I want to say always. We could get into all kinds of weeds there, but set aside that part, even just from my own personal, I don't feel good. I don't feel happy when that's the case. So I don't want to create something that makes me do something that forces me to feel stressed and unhappy. So let's pick something less obviously bad, like lying, and say, if I would not want to construct a business where I need to have back-to-back 10-minute phone calls all day long for 10 hours a day. Now, there may be reasons I have to do that sometimes, but I don't want the business to only work if I continue doing that, because for me, that's going to make me really unhappy. I need some heads down time, right? So it's not like a principle of the universe, but it's me understanding, okay, certain things need to be true for me. And I want to build everything from those. And so they can be things that are more preference-based, more based on the laws of reality. But to me, it's like the things that are unchanging, let's start there And then let's sort of figure out what we build on top of that.
Yes, I love this. And I love this as the way that we're starting because, like you said, they're the fundamentals. They're the things that are unchanging, right? And so sometimes they're so simple that people don't ask the question. They don't rewind almost and go back to those questions because it almost seems so simple. It almost seems dumb. But this is what this episode is all for. So I want to ask you a couple of just like absolutely fundamental, so simple questions that some people might be listening and be like, okay, why are you asking such a simple question? And hopefully your answers kind of give and shine a light into why they're so important. So first question that I want to ask you is, what is education anyways?
That is not a simple question, actually. It's kind of one of those things we all talk about it. We all kind of roughly know what we mean, but when you're asked to define it, it's very hard to define. So I'm just shooting from the hip here. I don't have some preset definition of education that I return to. So if I've described it elsewhere, other places, forgive me, but this is just going top of mind. I think of education as simply a process of gaining knowledge or ability. Any kind of process that helps you understand and navigate the world better. It's very broad, but now you could get into like, well, what counts as a process? I suppose you could say any experience or activity that helps you navigate the world better, understand and navigate the world better. But I think process sort of moves it into something slightly more repeatable or systematic. Like something could happen. I could walk outside and a acorn could fall on my head. And I learned something in that moment. Right. So like I did that was maybe a part of, you could call that education. I would call that like a single thing happened and I learned from it. If I said, okay, now I'm going to try to, every time I walk outside, observe what's happening. And then I'm going to like write it down or something. I turned it into something more repeatable. That to me feels more like education, but it's maybe splitting hairs. It doesn't necessarily have to be a process, but I tend to think of it as like some kind of repeatable or slightly more consistent process by which you are gaining knowledge and ability. I don't know. What's your definition?
Honestly, I'm working on that as I get inside of OpenEd and as I start to learn more about this market. Like, I think there were so many things that I thought education was about, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever especially I was going through school. There were a lot of misconceptions of what I thought education was, and I'm just now starting to realize as I'm going through and defining terms how I started to define education in terms of school. So like I saw those two things as synonymous and basically the same thing. It was like you are educated through school and that's it. And like that is your option. And so right now I'm definitely reestablishing my beliefs in terms of education and in terms of like, these very, very fundamental questions. Like
Okay. So you made me think of something all of a sudden. We're spitballing here, top of mind. But I wonder if maybe a useful way to talk about the difference between education and what's often called education, the difference between education and conditioning.
Interesting.
So maybe education needs to involve some kind of agency on the part of the person learning, some kind of conscious awareness of this process, some kind of willingness, like, hey, I want to learn, gain knowledge and gain understanding and skill, or some willful participation in activities that give you knowledge or skill. Whereas conditioning, it's like you can change somebody in ways that are bad for them and that don't help them necessarily achieve their own goals. So, the way that experiments with conditioning animals to salivate every time they hear a bell ring, right? Humans can be conditioned too. You lock somebody up in a cell and you reward them for certain things and punish them for certain things. It's going to change their behavior. It's going to alter the way they see the world, right? It's going to alter the things, the thoughts that they have. So conditioning, like, I think is, and everyone will be conditioned to some extent by their environment, whether it's intentional or not. But The things you see as possible are going to shape, where your brain can go, et cetera. But I think conditioning is sort of like on the side of the individual who's being conditioned. It's kind of not chosen, let's say. Now, unless you choose, right? And then to me, that's called education, right? So maybe that's the difference. Maybe there's some kind of agency involved, because I think a lot of what happens in like what's traditionally called education is more like conditioning. We put you in an environment of rewards and punishments against your will, and it changes you. It changes your behavior. It changes your ability to think of possibilities. It changes your knowledge set. But you didn't really become educated. You didn't really learn how to think, how to approach problems and break them down. You learned how to respond to avoid pain and to obtain reward, but in the way that an animal would. You didn't learn to access the higher rational faculties that man has to the same degree. I don't know. Maybe that's a rabbit trail, but I think there's something different there, because when you ask me what education is, I can think of a lot of ways. Like, yes, people can gain knowledge and potentially know-how in ways that I would consider very destructive to them, that look more like conditioning, like you would to a monkey who you're trying to teach not to touch the barbed wire or whatever. So anyway, little bit of a ramble there, but maybe there's a distinction that involving agency on the part of the learner.
I think that's a very important point, actually, because you mentioned the term educated, right? And like for so long, I had the belief that to be educated, quote unquote, was to go through higher ed, or like to be
to have
schooled.
a credential.
To have a credential, exactly. And I don't think that's exactly accurate. And I think the distinction that you made right there, where it's just like, are you conscious of what you know even? Or are you conscious of not just what, but also why? Like, that's actually extremely important and valuable.
Yeah. The paper certificates, for the most part, show what level of conditioning you have received, not what level of education you have.
So let's go into that a little bit. What is the value? So you were talking about education, and you were saying that it's the process of gaining knowledge or ability / know-how. Why is that so important for individuals?
Look, I almost feel like you got to reverse the question. The burden of proof seems to be the other way around. Like, humans will and must learn. It can't be stopped. I mean, take a child, and from the youngest age, they're taking in their surroundings, they're observing, they're watching what other people do, and then they're experimenting. They're trying to do those things themselves. They're emulating, they're copying. Then they're innovating. They're taking things they've seen and they're putting their own little twist on it to see if they can solve problems better, right? Take a little toddler, that's seen people use a footstool to rest their feet on. They want to reach something on a shelf. They've also seen people move things around on the floor. They put those together and they move the footstool over by the shelf and they use it as a step to get up and reach what they want to get. Like, that's learning, right? That's a combination of theory and practice right there. That's innate to humans. They're observing the world and they're bumping around and testing things. Can I move this? Let me see what happens if I push it. And then there's theory going on. They're obviously abstracting in some way to recognize that this object, which they've never observed being used to stand on by somebody, could be used to stand on. They've seen people stand on something to get higher, walking up a steps, and like connecting those dots. That's like understanding how systems work, how analogies work. This is like this. This could be used as a step stool because it has similar properties. Like, humans just do this. You don't have to do anything for our brains to work that way. So recognizing we need to learn, we are always going to learn, and saying this like brings us closer to our goals, to happiness, to fulfillment, to a good life, whatever you want to call it. Let's put fuel on this. Let's do this the best way that we can. And the older we get, the more conscious we become of this and the more self-reflective we're thinking about what it is that we're thinking and what it is that we're doing, and recognizing like, hey, I want to do this more, or I want to learn specific things in specific areas to solve specific problems. What's the best way to learn? You can't shut that down in humans. You can suppress it and warp them, but it's not going to, like, they're still going to be trying to do that. So I think it's important just because it's human. Like, education is a must. We'll put it this way, to paraphrase, C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy has to exist if for no other reason than that bad philosophy does. Like good education needs to exist if for no other reason than that bad education will. Like we will be learning things. We will be experiencing education, whether it's intentional or not. So let's try to make sure it's the best that it can be. And a lot of times, by the way, it involves less conscious creation of exactly what that process should be and a little more room for free exploration and play.
I love this, and I'm going to go back into the question of like what is good education then. But before I do, I think it's so fascinating that you said that about the idea of learning being so human, because I actually, whenever you said it, I was like, oh yeah, like I almost had to remind myself in the moment that we take for granted the fact that we as humans like to learn, and we've been told in so many ways that we must have an external force pushing us to learn, otherwise we're not going to. And I think in a lot of ways that conditioning has made it so that young children, young students, people don't learn unless they're forced to anymore, right? Like you're watching shows on your TV, you're doing all these things, but like it's almost divorced our sense of self as learners, which is an interesting thing. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. I mean, as a parent, especially if you have multiple kids and you can see how each of them are so different, you often confront this problem of to what extent do I require things of my kids and to what extent do I simply make options available to them? And if you don't require anything of your kids, then you can start to see some negative things. Like they need some kind of constraints. They need some kind of boundaries. They need some kind of encouragements, maybe bargains sometimes. Okay, you really want this. If you keep your room clean for 2 weeks, then I'll give it. Like sometimes those things are really valuable and really necessary as a way to incrementally get them to where they have full independence and responsibility as an adult, to kind of like introduce smaller, ever increasing elements of that. But then there's a degree to which you go too far. If everything in their life is mandated and required, and they have very little scope for their own goal setting, their own planning how they're going to use their time, then they start to see everything as obligatory, even the really good stuff. If it's an assignment, it must not be very good. Because if it was good, you wouldn't need to tell me to do it. I'd do it on my own, right? Like all I want to do is trade baseball cards, but you're forcing me to read this, Tom Sawyer. Well, therefore, Tom Sawyer must be not very fun. It must be, if you wouldn't have to force me otherwise, right? And a lot of people who actually would enjoy reading Tom Sawyer end up not enjoying it because we all kind of have that rebellious independent thing in us, for better or worse. And you're like, well, that was forced on me, right? I mean, how many people take like the classic books that everyone's forced to read in school? It's like people think of those as stuff you're supposed to read. They don't think of those as like, oh, like, let's check this out. Maybe this is cool. Maybe it's not. Some of those books are actually really lame, and I don't think anybody would read them if everybody wasn't forced to. Some of them are actually great. I think way more people would read them, right? But it's like, it gets crammed into there. So trying to figure out to what extent you can let people discover things. It's funny. My youngest child, I would say, is like my most untainted. It's like, he just thinks everything is interesting and he wants to learn about everything. And even though we've done various forms of homeschooling, alternative schooling with all of the kids, like we've just gotten better as parents at learning that combination of challenging and pushing them as well as giving them free space. So we will require him to do, like, I made him take piano lessons, but I didn't ask him. I was just like, hey, you're going to start taking piano lessons. And he doesn't have a ton of negative experience with us making him do stuff. And so he was like, really cool. And he's all excited and he like loves it, practices all the time. Now, part of that's just personality, but part of it's like, if you get it right, it's not that he would have gone and taught himself piano by himself. Maybe he would have, but we did just introduce that to him. But because we're not controlling everything all the time and he has a lot of scope for play, and if he's interested in something, we'll help chase that interest, he doesn't perceive us introducing new things into his schedule as a threat or an attempt to control him. Now, again, part of that's his personality. He's a little easier in that way, but part of it is we've kind of learned how to get that dance a little bit better. By the time you have your fourth kid, you're like, sorry to the first three, but thank you. You helped us figure it out for the last one. He's going to have a better time than everybody else. But I think there is something there. There's a combination of constraints and guidance and requirements from parents, as well as freedom to explore and learn so that you don't have those negative connotations.
That's interesting. Do you think that's possible on a large level, or is that the part of the problem? It's like you can't, create this much freedom for lots of kids at one time. And, we have this big thing that is school. And it's really hard to do that, create an individualized education, a personalized education on a large level for every kid.
This is what I love about the concept of opening up education, because I don't know that I have an answer to that question. I don't know that any one individual does, but that's what's exciting. It's like in the free market, if you were to say, let's imagine a world where it was like a, Soviet system and the government had always provided all food. And you said to somebody, well, imagine if they didn't. Well, what would happen? What would a food store look like? What would be the ideal food store? How many people would there have to be, like food stores that only served like 10 people and to their niche tastes, and there was just like thousands of them? Would you have, the answer would be, I don't know. Nobody knows. But we're going to see what happens if we open up the market, and we're going to have all kinds of entrepreneurs trying all kinds of things. A lot of them will fail and a lot of them will succeed, and there'll be all kinds of stuff, and it will change all the time. So I think like it's probably possible to have a less restrictive education that can be done for large numbers of kids at the same time. What could it look like? I don't know. There's lots of different models. There's lots of different ways that it could look. Maybe it has to be smaller scale. Maybe it has to be more individualized. I mean, there's interesting, school, the Sudbury Valley School. It's called a school, but it's like kids show up and basically do whatever they want all day. And there's parents around to kind of like make sure nobody, kills themselves or anything. But it's fascinating. You can go read books. I mean, it's been around for a long time. A few other Sudbury schools have started, and like, I don't know the varying success, but it hasn't become very widespread. I don't know. Is it because it can only be small, or is it just that people haven't bought into that yet? You have micro schools, you have all these different things. And to me, it's like, the answer is yes to all of them. Like, let's just let it proliferate and let's see what ends up turning out. And I wouldn't be surprised if you have some things that are very large and that serve large number of kids at once. For certain subjects, for example, or certain experiences, well, that could be great. Or having some standardization can be great. I mean, a sports team is kind of like this. Once you get past the very, very entry level, you don't want a sports team where every kid's version of how to practice baseball is totally different and they all play first base in their own special way. The coach is going to be like, I have a philosophy and approach. And like, that's okay. That kind of standardization. Again, if the child is interested in that thing, there are other things where you want to have maximum flexibility and creativity, and you don't want to constrain at all. You want to see what happens. You want to unleash that stuff. I don't know the answer to like, is there a model to give kids the freedom that they need that can serve tons of kids at once? My answer is, I'm sure there probably are various ways to do that, and probably some that are in operation now. But the key is to like, let a million flowers bloom, and let's see, and let's pick and choose for our kids.
I love that. I wanted to ask about the distinction between open education and education. So how would you explain the difference between, all of the different, I guess, models of education, just the broad concept of education, and the very specific concept that is open education, that is what we're doing here?
It's funny. It's kind of like in philosophy, there's a school of philosophy called pragmatism. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I'm going to define this perfectly or anything, but as I understand it, my midwit understanding is essentially like, hey, let's look at all the schools of philosophy and like, let's just see what works to help us think clearer and live better. And if I can take a little something from existentialism, and I can take a little something from stoicism, and I can take a little, like, cool. If it works, if it's useful. And I think it's essentially that with education. Like, instead of trying to decide, you have this idea, education. Okay, I have to improve, gain knowledge and skills. Okay, so what's the best way to do that? And as a parent, you feel all this pressure. How do I figure out what's the best way to educate my kids? Okay, I've been reading all this stuff about classical education and all these things. I think maybe this is it. But then one of my kids is really having a hard time with that. And I got this tension. Or I've been reading all about unschooling and just like wild and free, let the kids kind of set their own thing. But this isn't really working for me. I'm all stressed all the time and all chaotic. Or, like you feel this pressure to solve education. What is the ideal education? How do I pick the perfect mode, the perfect approach? Is it being in school? Is it not being in school? Is it hiring a tutor? Like, if you can sort of say, I don't know the answer to there is no like one form of education that's ideal. The answer is each kid at each stage of life, what do they need? And I want to look at all options. I don't want to close myself off because I have a ideological commitment to a particular school or to a particular approach to education and say, well, I have to do this because you know what? We're a public school family. So sorry, all my kids are going to go to public school. Like, okay, maybe if that works for them, but be open to say, yeah, maybe all my kids but one. Maybe my kids will go there for 3 years and then they'll go somewhere else. Maybe they'll start with like, just break open, give yourself the permission to pick and choose. That's open education. Kind of like dissolve those debates. You don't have to answer the question, what's a good education? You only have to answer the question, what's a good education for my child right now? What does that contain? I don't care what's good for society as a whole, for all children everywhere, I can't answer those questions. And I don't want to try. I'll probably turn into a giant jerk if I go try to impose my view of education on everyone. Instead, let's just bring it back to what do my kids need right now, right here? And what are all the options on the table? And let me pick and choose and let me create those combinations and let me share what works and what doesn't work. And like, it's okay. Not everything works. Nothing works perfectly. So I think that's kind of the idea. It's very pragmatic.
I love that. As a parent who's gone through this, how can you tell if a specific method or approach is working for your kid? What are some like, I guess, leading indicators that you're like, okay, I think this is actually working, or some things that would indicate that maybe you should change your approach? Because I think that's really important for parents.
Yeah, that's really hard. That's a good question. It's funny. It's kind of like my instinctive response is I know it when I see it. And then I'm trying to think like, well, how do I know? Like when you just know sometimes when your kids are not doing well, when they're struggling in some ways. Now, some ways it could be obvious stuff, like they're acting up and they're, screaming and being bratty and whatever, visible, obvious things, making the house chaotic. But often it's just more, they just don't seem to be really flourishing. And there's just and it's funny, it's not just about their happiness, right? Because there are times where, my kids are doing some drudgery or some chore and they're not happy about it. But I can tell, even if, we've made them, let's say, clean up the room that the common room, the den area. And they're all in there and they're all grumpy about it and they don't want to be doing it. But I can overhear them. They're talking with each other. They're kind of like joking. And then when they're done, they have that glow like of pride. They got something done. I can tell they're doing well, even though they would tell you, oh, I don't want to do this, right? They may not appear happy. So it's not just like, oh, just give your kids whatever to make them happy. That's not what I'm getting at. Like, how do they flourish? You can tell. Some kids will tell you and other kids won't tell you. You have to tease it out of them. You just have to know if they're quieter, they're not as, open with their feelings. They just they carry themselves. It's funny. You can almost just physically tell. And I don't want to presume about other people's children, but I mean, we've all had this experience. Watch kids in your neighborhood walking home from school, walking home off the bus. And there's like a certain slouched shoulder, kind of slump, kind of like, and it's different from, I got a son who works full time and he does physical work. He returns from a hard day's work. He's physically tired. I get that. This is different. There's like a defeatism to it that you can see sometimes. So I think it's like just really knowing those small things. And it's not that hard. I don't think it's some huge secret. Most parents would probably tell you, if you asked them, is it easy for you to tell when your kid is flourishing or not? They probably tell you, yeah. Like, I don't think it's that hard. I don't know if I can give you any more concrete signs than that.
I think that's good and valuable. Yeah, there's like the subconscious, mechanisms inside of our brains. Like even like micro expressions, like you can just tell. But what's interesting is,
or if there's conflict all the time, like with my oldest, when he was very like verbally smart, had a good vocabulary, and was very good at articulating himself. And so we're like, oh, well, we'll be able to teach him to read at an early age. So, we tried starting to teach him to read at like 4.5. Didn't work. 5 didn't work. By 6, they're like, fine, I give up. I'm just gonna see what happens. I'm just not gonna try to teach you to read, because it was conflict every time we would try. We tried reading the little Bob books. We tried, flashcards. We tried different stuff. And it was just like, no, I don't want to do this. Just like, and not always even in a bratty way, but just hard. Like, it was so hard. It just wasn't getting anywhere. We're just butting heads. It wasn't clicking. And for him, we just stopped. And then we used to read him every night before he went to bed. He had Kelvin and Hobbes comics that I had given him that I had when I was a kid. And we used to read them to him. And one night it was like really late. He went to bed late for some reason. And I was like, no, it's too late. I'm not going to read you a story tonight. And he's like, please. I'm like, nope. And then I walked by the room later, and he's in there and he's reading it to himself. Now, he told me later that he wasn't actually reading it at first. We'd read it so many times that he could look at the pictures and he had it memorized. So he's just saying it out loud. But at some point within 6 months, that turned into him actually reading. I don't know how. He just taught himself to read. Like, I don't know. But for us, knowing that the approach, I didn't know what approach to take. So I was like, forget it. I'm just going to go hands off for a while. I don't even know what to do, because everything was creating conflict. So sometimes it's like, it's obvious. It's just not working. You're just butting heads constantly. They're not learning. You're stressed all the time. And just saying, okay, there has to be a different approach. Sometimes it's like the Hippocratic Oath, like first do no harm. Okay, this is doing harm. It's not helping, and it's doing harm to our relationship, if nothing else. How about I just stop? If I don't know what to do that's better, let me just stop doing the thing that's causing all the problems and just like let it breathe for a little bit. And not every time is your kid going to go teach themselves something, but they will sometimes. So anyway, I think that can be an obvious way.
That reminds me of, kind of related, but not entirely, but like during COVID, whenever everybody stopped using all of the channels and all the waterways, like we just stopped. And then there's something about like the natural progression of the way that things work, like homeostasis. Like things want to be natural. They want to be in line with the way that they're made to be. And so all of a sudden you see these whales coming back into these canals, and, and I think that's kind of similar to what you're saying, where it's basically like sometimes if something's not working and you're doing negative harm, just let it be, and maybe nature will take its course, and it'll just happen.
That can be one of the biggest freeing things for parents who do have a kid that's in school that's struggling, that's suffering in some way. Sometimes you don't need to have an answer for what to do instead. If they're really suffering, if you can just pull them out, just get them out of there. Take a little time, and often they'll start to kind of come down. They'll kind of detox from that environment, that high stress, tense environment, and then they'll start to open up a little bit, and it'll start to get easier to figure out what pathways to take. But in the midst of, when you're still in the stressful, anxiety creating, threatening situation, you can't think clearly. You can't identify what's a better alternative oftentimes.
Yeah, I love that. I wanted to ask you about the cost of consciously schooling, right? Because like if you are going to sit down and start to teach yourself about these different options, if you're going to sit down and start to like, it takes a lot to really pay attention to your kids and to really notice things and to really start to understand how they work, what they might be interested in. Why is that worth it? What is the cost?
It's funny. The cost can be anywhere from quite low to very, very, very high. And the difference, like there's no limit to how much you could spend if you wanted to, right? In time and money and resources. But the difference in outcomes for kids, I feel like you get the first 80% of the value just by doing any kind of flexible open education at all. Just by stepping back and saying, I'm not going to just unthinkingly plug my kids into somebody else's form of education without considering what's great for them. And if you say, I'm not going to do that, let me zoom out. What do I think is going to work for this kid this year? What are their goals and needs? What are my goals and needs? What's the best way to get the best combination for everybody? It's never going to be perfect. You're always going to have some trade-offs. It's like buying a house. You're never going to get all the things on your list, but you're going to get some things you didn't expect. And so, like you figure out what's the best you can do given your constraints, and just making that choice and coming up with something that's like slightly at least more conscious and customized is going to get you 80% of the value. And then you can spend tons of time and money and resources to eke out as much of that additional 20% of the value as you can. But if you get 80% of it, like nobody gets 100. So maybe maybe you can spend, a handful of hours a week and a couple hundred or a couple grand a year on a kid and get 80% of the value. Or you can spend 40 hours a week like a full-time job and $50,000 a year to make the most crazy custom education ever, and you'll get 95% of the value. So like, what's the delta on that 15%? Or maybe you only add, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's a good way to think about it. So don't think of it as this sort of all or nothing. It's like the biggest chunk of value can be had relatively inexpensively, especially with young kids. It's more about if you have a parent who's able to be with them in the day, right? The biggest value to most people of the traditional school system is just that it's free daycare. Just like, if parents are working and they can't be with their kids, where can they go that I can afford to have them? So if you need solving for that, that's the biggest part. If they're not going to be plugged into that system, is there some other version? Is there some, private school or charter school, or is there some sort of co-op? Is there some sort of homeschool collective where each parent takes the kids 1 day a week and maybe you can work 4 days a week instead of 5? Can you split time? Like, solving for that, I think, is the biggest one. Having the ability for something more than just, I need a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. daycare every day. Once you solve for that, the rest of it, I think the returns on it are much, much smaller. And even that, there's ways to get really creative. There really are. I mean, look at all these micro schools. Like, hey, I need my kid to be somewhere while I'm working all day. Well, instead of just assuming the only option is, whatever public school district I live in, maybe there's something that's, a teacher from that school who doesn't necessarily love teaching there. Can you do a micro school? What if you have 20 or 50 kids? And can you figure out a way to get that down to a couple grand a kid? And it could be in a church building, right? Like, this stuff is exploding for a reason. And a lot of these things are a lot more accessible than people think. So I think starting with, what does my kid need right now? What would be the best thing for them? Like, what would be the best thing for them? And then outlining that and then saying, okay, if that's not attainable, what's something that's a little closer to that than what I currently have that is attainable, right? And just start there. Just take some little steps. But if you do have the ability to, like if you have one parent that's not working, that's at home, the actual dollar cost can be very, very low. And homeschool parents, homeschool moms especially, shout out to homeschool moms. They're like financial wizards. They find ways to do insane, amazing, crazy cool stuff with their kids for like $12.27. You know what I mean? And they're like down to that. The difference between $12.27 and $12.30 is going to be, they'll notice, right? Like, it's crazy. It's so cool when you kind of get it. And there's a whole kind of community of people finding ways to do things really cheaply, bargaining with local businesses who don't get a lot of traffic during the school day because everybody's in school, doing like collective. I mean, it's really cool. You can actually do these things if you have the ability to be with your kid at least some of the time. The dollar cost and materials and things like that can be very, very low. You really can. You'd be amazed what you can do.
That's so true. I think you hit on a really interesting point there, which is also that there are a lot of parents who are getting into this. And I mean, even parents who have been inside of this for a long time who are afraid of doing it wrong. Like, there's so many ways to do it. There are so many different options. There's so many different curriculums. Like, it's really a choose your own adventure in so many ways. But like, there is pressure and there is a lot of stigma, and especially there was in the past a lot of stigma around being a homeschooler and or being, an alternative education schooler. So it's like there's pressure to do it right, and then there's additional pressure because other people are looking at you. What advice would you give to people, or like what words of wisdom would you give to people who are experiencing that right now?
Yeah, what's helped me the most is When it comes to educating your kids, instead of thinking, how do I figure out how to do it right? I gotta get it figured out. I gotta do it right. Think of it less like a painting and more like a sculpture. So it's not, what are all the right brush strokes? And I got to make sure it's all going to turn out well. Think of it like, okay, here's this hunk of granite. Let me just remove the parts that I know I don't want. What are the things that I know are not good for my kids? Everything else is fair game. What are the things that are doing them harm or causing them to behave in a way that I don't like or seem to be making them grumpier or right? They're not learning. Something is not working. If you can just remove those things, everything else is open. You can try it. You can test it out. And for each kid, you'll start to build a longer and longer list of things that are not a good fit until you kind of whittle down to what's a path, what's an approach that works really well for them. And that's where that sculpture will start to emerge. So I just like to reverse that burden of proof. Instead of saying what's the right thing, just make a huge list of all the stuff that doesn't seem to work for each kid. And don't feel bad if some of those things are things that work really well for everyone else or things that look really good and prestigious in other people's eyes. Like if you just know that certain things do not work well for your kid, don't do them. Just eliminate the bad. Start there. It's a lot easier.
Yeah, it's choose the game you're playing and just focus on yourself. I definitely think that's really difficult, but it is getting easier, and that was something that was encouraging to me to see. I went to that to a curriculum fair in Utah, and just the amount of parents that were there, the amount of students that were there, the amount of even providers that were there. Like the education landscape, it's changing so much, and the idea of personalizing education, the idea of opening up education and allowing people to make decisions is just absolutely incredible. It's mind-blowing. I did not know before I got into OpenEd how much just action was happening inside of this space.
The most exciting thing about working with people who are approaching their kids' education in an open way, whether they're homeschooling or doing some form of microschooling alternative, is those parents are relentless learners themselves. Their curiosity is undimmed. Now maybe they're harried and tired and stressed sometimes, right? I know I am, but they are constantly exploring and learning and testing and experimenting for their kids, but that results in them always expanding their own horizons. And they're just like relentlessly curious and interested. And you start asking questions about what do you do for your kids? What are you using for this? And you just find the most interesting stuff you'd never think of. Cool ideas for learning different topics that they just came up with through trial and error because they're just really relentless. They don't have the option of putting it on autopilot. They've chosen to be intentional, and that's made them more interesting as human beings, regardless of like the outcomes for their kids are going to be better. But it's just really cool to hang out with educators, parents who are educating their children in this way.
Yeah, it's also extremely energizing because they have just like a sense of the childlike wonder about the world as well that they're both experiencing and participating in and also borrowing from their kids, which is just really awesome to see in a world that I think has lost that in a lot of ways.
Yep. Your kids will force you to do the stuff that you're always trying to get them to do, to try new things, to be open-minded, to be curious. If you want to try to help them learn, you'll be pushed, and it's a blast.
I love that. Okay, so I have two final questions for you. One is an interesting. So whenever I was first getting started at OpenEd, I was telling somebody the idea of what we were doing, what we were excited about, and they asked me this question. So I want to hear your thoughts on it. They were like, "How do you know that parents are going to educate their kids well? Like, how do you know they're not going to indoctrinate them into beliefs that are actually negative for society?" What is your thought there?
So I would turn the question around and say, how do you know that anyone else is going to educate your kid better? What are the odds that someone who doesn't have to live with them every day, who doesn't feel deep joy over their success and deep pain over their failure, is going to care more and do a better job of ensuring their education? What are the odds of that happening? It reminds me of famous economist Milton Friedman. He was asked, what doesn't capitalism just reward greed? And he said, show me a system that doesn't reward greed. You think communists aren't greedy? You think that doesn't reward greed? Right? Like greed, you can't get rid of. humans not knowing what they're doing, you can't get rid of, right? Whether it's parents or teachers, we're imperfect. There's going to be, every kid is going to have people who are trying to educate them who do things wrong. The question is, who has the best incentive? And if you have a system where the layers and layers of bureaucracy, funding that's coming from one place, and protections for people through, unions where there's not a lot of accountability, to the individual kid. It's more about the outcomes for the school, for some national bureaucracy or some state level bureaucracy. You look at all the incentive structure in most of the education system, and you compare that to the incentives that a parent faces for their kid being successful in life. And you tell me which incentive structure. This is first principles thinking that we opened up with. Like, I don't need to answer the question of how every specific individual child is going to be educated successfully by their parent. Nobody can answer that. And I can't answer that for how they're going to be educated successfully by a public or private school teacher. Nobody can answer that. And certainly we know there's tons of evidence that they're not being successfully educated in those latter situations. And of course, homeschoolers can have that as well, right? The outcomes tend to look really good, but you can't say it's always going to be perfect. Get to the first principles. Who is more likely? Parents have to deal with their children and their children's lives and outcomes and success regardless. Education is one part of that. So saying that this one part we're going to take and give it to someone who's less vested and they're going to magically do a better job. Like, it's not that parents are doing the educating, it's that parents are the ones trying to figure out what is the best education. And by the way, that's happening even if they're going to public schools. You ever look at the real estate market? Prices are based so much on school districts, on people's belief in the quality of those schools. Parents are already choosing where they live, where they put they're already making choices for their kids' education. The idea of open education is to say, let's open up the number of boxes you're choosing between, instead of just which public school will my kid go to, or which private school will they go to, or which homeschool curriculum. Open up all of those and say, which combination of these this year or tomorrow? Parents are already making these choices. So it's not like parents aren't doing anything, right? So this is just trying to help them make those choices better because they are the best positioned to help their kids succeed.
Phenomenal answer.
Well, that was way too long of an answer, though. Your friend would have been asleep by now.
No, that was a phenomenal answer. I guess along that same line, paint your ideal future for the category of open education. What does it look like?
Yeah, I think what excites me is this is not an ideal future I have to imagine in some sort of like utopian construct. It is the direction I see things heading already, and just following that trend line and saying, hey, I can see the wave. I can see what's starting to happen. And then kind of extrapolating out what that might look like down the road. So micro schools are going crazy. There's just thousands of micro schools founded usually by a parent or a teacher who is in the traditional system that said, you know what? I think I could have a much better experience for myself and for students if I just did a school for 10 or 20 kids. And I had more flexibility, and I had, so you're seeing an explosion of those. You're seeing an explosion of education savings accounts where states are saying, instead of giving the money to the school, we'll give money to the parents, and they can use it not just for tuition at a private school. They can use it for their own customized education. They can do co-ops and courses and all these different things. You're seeing those of 15 states pass those just last year. Why? Because all parents like them. This is what's crazy. This is not a partisan issue. You ask the most blue state, inner city, hardcore Democrats, and they want education choice. They want an open education. They want all these options. They love it. You ask the most red state, rural person who's out there on the farm, they want it too. Everybody does. That's what's amazing, because people want the flexibility, and they're recognizing the need to adapt the way that we educate, the way that we approach education. As the world has changed, we're way beyond the factory system of the economy, and the school system looks kind of like the factory, right? And nobody works like that anymore. So why educate like that? So everybody wants it, and the market and policy are both starting to respond, but it's still early. It's still in the early days. Like, there have been people doing this for a really long time. homeschooling and things like that, but you've had this proliferation of approaches and of different models. You've got Acton Academy out there. You've got, all the Montessori schools have been around for a while. You've got, like I said, unschooling, world schooling, people who are permanently remote, who are doing taking their kids with them to travel around if they have a remote job. Like, it's incredible. So I just see that becoming so much more common, and the line between all these things blurring. Like, oh, my kid's enrolled at whatever public school, but they're only there 2 days a week. And then they're doing this thing over here and this other, like more and more of that. It's going to be happening. Public schools are losing enrollments, and they're having to adapt. Okay, well, can we offer some virtual options? Can we say you can leave for the second half of the day and go do asynchronous virtual curricula and still pass the state test for parents who want to be a part of that system? Those are starting to come out as options. There's just this entire breaking down of these boundaries. Like, it's already happening. It's in the very early stages. But if you've met people who are in it, they have more energy and enthusiasm, and there's more innovation going on there than anywhere else. It's going to explode. So it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be build your own education. I think people will approach each child's learning for each year, much like if you go to college as a student, you look at the course catalog and you create your own schedule. But you're going to be able to look not just at one institution's course catalog, but every online provider, every in-person provider, whether public, private, or tutor or homeschool, all of them, and you'll pick and choose and you'll customize your own schedule for each kid each year. That's the future that I see coming for more and more people who want it. And ideally, that's the future for everybody, because it's not a prescription of what you should do. It's just opening up what you can do.
That was incredible. I think that's a perfect note to end this on. We hope, the whole OpenEd team, me and Isaac, we hope that everybody else listening to this can get as excited about this vision as we can, that you are subscribed to the newsletter where we share so many good tips, tricks, things that are happening in the education space. And we hope that you listen to every episode after this. Is there anything else that we should shout out?
No, I was just gonna say we gotta tease your story out, because you kind of did a combination, didn't you, of some homeschooling, some public schooling, right?
No, I did private school all the way through.
Oh, you did? I thought you did some kind of, like, in high school, you did some kind of homeschooling thing.
My brother did. So
Okay.
my parents started getting, I guess, more active with the way that they were schooling us whenever they had my brother. So the last
I told
kid.
you, the youngest kid
Yeah.
always, the parents have learned,
Yeah, he also has the most interesting story because he's been building a lot. So he recently did a engineering camp at MIT. He built on the side. He does tons of different competitions, and like he has fostered such an interesting passion that I don't think any of me or my other siblings, which I have 3 siblings total. Sorry, I forgot there for a second. I have 3 siblings, and the other 2 and me, we didn't get that opportunity, but he did through the way that he was nurtured as a kid. And he's only 16, but he has a really bright future ahead of him.
So we'll have to get maybe over future episodes as you're hosting, or maybe we can bring you on and I can interview you. We got to tease out more of your story and how you got where you are, because I know you have a lot of really interesting insights, and I just talked for like 80% of the time. So
I loved it though. You are a wealth of knowledge, so thank you so much.
I had a blast.